The Hartwell Gala had always been a cathedral of wealth, where polished marble floors reflected chandeliers like frozen constellations, and violins sang over the low hum of ambition. Every year, the most powerful names gathered under one roof to remind the world and themselves that the Hartwell Empire was untouchable. But this year, beneath the glitter and champagne, something darker pulsed. Isabella Hartwell stood near the edge of the ballroom, a crystal flute untouched in her hand. She wore a gown of deep emerald satin that flowed like a river, its elegance interrupted only by the quiet hush that followed her wherever she moved. Her face, once the subject of admiration in glossy magazines, bore scars from the fire that had stolen more than just her beauty. Pale ridges traced across her cheek and temple, reaching toward her neck, a map of pain carved into her skin. The whispers always came. They floated like smoke, too soft to confront yet heavy enough to suffocate. She used to be stunning. Poor thing. Why did her father bring her here? Her father, Richard Hartwell, stood at the center of the gala, surrounded by sycophants. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, his tailored suit flawless, his voice steady with authority. To him, tonight was not about family, but about legacy. The presence of his scarred daughter was a calculated move, a reminder to the world that even tragedy could not shatter the Hartwell name. But he never once looked in her direction. Not really. Isabella felt invisible and exposed all at once. She hated the silence between songs when eyes inevitably found her. When the orchestra began again, relief usually came. Yet tonight, the music only sharpened her isolation. Because the dance floor, polished to a mirror's sheen, remained a stage she could no longer claim. Couples glided, spun, and laughed, but no one approached her. Not a single man dared offer his hand. Across the room, Daniel Hayes adjusted the tray balanced on his palm. His crisp white shirt and black vest were stiff with starch, but his tired eyes betrayed the weight of long shifts. At 34, he carried himself with quiet resilience, the kind born of necessity. Every step, every polite smile was not for himself, but for Sophie, his 7-year-old daughter who slept soundly at home, dreaming of stories he told her before every shift. Daniel had worked galas before, but this one felt different. The wealth here wasn't just on display, it was sharpened into a weapon. Guests looked at waiters like moving furniture. He was used to being overlooked, but his gaze, unbidden, kept drifting toward Isabella. Not because of her scars, but because she stood so utterly alone. He saw the way men averted their eyes when passing her. He noticed the clenched jaw, the stillness in her shoulders that masked her hurt. Something inside him stirred, something protective, something human. He thought of Sophie, of how fragile her little heart was, and how he would never want her to feel discarded by the world. The orchestra shifted, violins swelling into a hauntingly beautiful waltz. It was the kind of song that begged to be danced to, yet Isabella remained a statue at the edge. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to bridge the unspoken divide. And then Daniel did something reckless. He lowered his tray onto a side table, ignoring the sharp glance of another waiter. His pulse hammered, but his decision felt strangely inevitable, as though the moment had been waiting for him. Step by step, he crossed the ballroom floor. Conversations faltered. Feet slowed. By the time he reached her, the entire room had turned toward them. Isabella looked up, startled. Her green eyes widened, uncertain whether to recoil or meet his gaze. Daniel, steady but humble, bowed slightly. His voice was low, just for her. "May I?" The words seemed to slice through the hush of the ballroom. For a heartbeat, Isabella froze. The fear, the doubt, the shame, all of it tangled inside her. She saw her father's distant figure, saw the expectant crowd waiting for her refusal. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to protect herself from the cruelty of hope. But something in Daniel's eyes, unpolished, uncalculated, simply kind, made her hesitate. He was not like the others. Her fingers trembled against the glass in her hand. Slowly, she set it down. And then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Gasps whispered across the room. Daniel extended his hand. Isabella placed hers in it, her palm cool against his warmth. Together, they stepped onto the dance floor. The violins rose higher, and the room seemed to dissolve into silence save for the haunting melody and the sound of their tentative steps. Richard Hartwell's jaw tightened from across the ballroom, his pride pricked like a vein. He had spent years shielding his daughter from pity, hiding her away, controlling every narrative. Yet here she was, stepping into the center of his empire with a stranger, a waiter no less. The dance began awkward, hesitant, but as Daniel guided her gently, Isabella felt something awaken inside her, a memory of who she had been before the fire, before the whispers. Her body remembered rhythm, grace, and defiance. Around them, the elite watched in stunned silence. And in that moment, beneath the chandeliers and the weight of 1,000 eyes, Isabella Hartwell was no longer invisible. She was seen. For the first time in years, she was not her scars. She was the dance. The ballroom's air shifted as Isabella and Daniel moved together. At first, their steps were uneven, as though the weight of the world clung to Isabella's feet. She felt the heat of eyes pressing against her skin, the scars she carried lit like fault lines beneath the chandeliers. Every whisper seemed to slice through her gown, exposing her to judgment. But Daniel's hand was steady. His palm against hers was firm, his lead gentle. There was no hesitation, no trace of pity, only an unspoken promise. You are not alone. Something inside her loosened. Her body, tense for so long, began to respond. Her feet found rhythm, her frame softened, and the haunting waltz lifted her higher. She caught glimpses of herself reflected in the polished floor. Scars illuminated, yes, but also movement, grace, defiance. She was no longer a statue in the shadows. She was alive, commanding the gaze of every soul in the room. Gasps turned to murmurs. Some eyes softened in awe, others narrowed in disapproval. But all were watching. At the far end of the hall, Richard Hartwell's expression hardened like stone. He had built his empire on control of markets, of people, of stories. Yet here, before his investors, partners, and rivals, his daughter had broken through his carefully constructed image. A waiter held her hand. A scarred woman stood in the center. Pride cracked under the strain of exposure. Still, Isabella didn't look toward her father. She was caught in the rhythm of the dance and the strange safety in Daniel's presence. His touch anchored her, not in ownership, but in respect. It was new, disarming, dangerous. The music swelled. The orchestra's strings reached their peak, wrapping around them like fire and smoke. Daniel guided her through a turn, her dress flaring, catching the light. For a moment, she almost forgot the scars. She almost forgot the whispers. She almost forgot that her father's empire stood on watching her like a trial. And then the music stopped. The silence was thunderous. Applause should have followed, but none came. Instead, there was only the sharp cough of disapproval, the hiss of wine poured into a glass, the tightening of lips. The silence was more brutal than laughter. Isabella's chest heaved, her hand still in Daniel's. She wanted to hold on, to stay in that fragile bubble of defiance. But reality returned like a blow. The orchestra players lowered their bows. The crowd's whispers returned with venom now sharpened. The Hartwell girl. Dancing with staff? How disgraceful! What a spectacle! Daniel felt her hand tremble. For a moment he feared she would pull away, retreat back into the shadows. But instead she drew a breath and lifted her chin. Her scarred face tilted toward the crowd with a defiance she hadn't known she possessed. And then came the sound Richard had been waiting for. His own voice, calm yet slicing through the murmurs like steel. That will be enough. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, his presence commanding. His eyes, cold as glass, fixed on Daniel first. The message was clear. You do not belong here. But then his gaze shifted to Isabella, and something unspoken passed between them. A war of love twisted into shame. His jaw tightened, his fists curled at his sides, but his voice betrayed nothing. You've made your point, Richard said, quiet enough for only the nearest guest to hear, yet loud enough to ripple through the silence. Isabella's heart thundered. Her father's tone, as always, was one of control, of finality. She had spent years obeying it, shrinking into his shadow. Yet tonight, something in her resisted. She did not lower her gaze. She did not step back. Daniel released her hand slowly, sensing the storm in the room. He bowed slightly, not to Richard but to Isabella. A quiet acknowledgement. Respect. Then he stepped aside, reclaiming his tray as though nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The whispers multiplied, the air thick with speculation. Isabella stood alone once more, though now the shadows felt different. She was not hiding. She had been seen, and she could not return to invisibility. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. It was firm, almost possessive. Come, he murmured, guiding her away from the dance floor. His smile returned, crafted for the cameras, but his grip betrayed his fury. The rest of the gala blurred around her. Isabella felt her father's pride wrapping around her like chains, heavier than ever. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted. Daniel's hand had lit something in her, a fire her father could not extinguish. And as she glanced back across the hall, she caught sight of him again. Daniel stood by the serving tables, tray balanced, face calm, yet his eyes found hers through the crowd. He didn't smile, didn't wave. But in that silent exchange, Isabella felt a truth stronger than the chandeliers above. For one fragile, impossible moment, she had been free. And freedom, once tasted, was impossible to forget. The Hartwell limousine glided through the city streets, its tinted windows sealing Isabella inside like a jewel in a locked box. The gala was over, but its shadows clung to her. She sat across from her father, the silence between them as sharp as broken glass. The glow of passing streetlights painted fleeting patterns across his face. Pride, anger, and something unspoken, all hidden behind his rigid composure. Richard Hartwell was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was punishment enough. Finally, he spoke. You embarrassed yourself tonight. The words landed like a verdict. Isabella stared at her hands in her lap, the faint tremor still lingering from the dance. Shame should have consumed her, but instead, a strange defiance stirred. She lifted her chin. No, she said softly. I didn't. Richard's gaze snapped toward her, cold and sharp. Do you know what it means when the daughter of the Hartwell Empire waltzes with the help? Do you know what investors saw? Weakness, vulnerability, a reminder that we can be undone. Isabella's voice wavered but held. Or maybe they saw strength. Maybe they saw me. His lips thinned, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He turned away, dismissing her as one might a child's tantrum. The rest of the ride was a suffocating silence. But inside Isabella, something had shifted. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her father's expectations, hiding her scars, hiding herself. But tonight, Daniel's steady hand had pulled her into the light. And, once seen, she could not return to being invisible. The next morning, the gala still lingered in whispers across the city's social columns. Headlines danced between scandal and intrigue. Heiress steps onto dance floor with staff. The Hartwell name, tarnished or transformed. Photographs captured the moment. Isabella's face half in shadow, half in light, her scars illuminated under the chandeliers. To some, she looked broken. To others, she looked defiant. Richard read every word at breakfast, his eyes narrowing with each headline. Isabella sat across from him, spoon untouched in her bowl of oatmeal. She waited for him to explode, but as always he chose silence, a weapon sharper than anger. Instead, he folded the paper neatly and said, "You will not attend next year's gala." The command was final. The gavel struck, but inside Isabella's chest the ember glowed hotter. She did not argue, not yet, but her silence this time was not submission. It was preparation. Daniel's morning was less glamorous. He rose before dawn, his apartment small but filled with warmth. Sophie sat at the table, her dark hair messy from sleep, drawing pictures with crayons while he brewed coffee. "How was work, Daddy?" she asked, not looking up from her paper. He hesitated, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Different," he said. "I danced." Sophie's eyes shot up, wide. "You danced? You never dance," Daniel chuckled. "That's true." "But someone needed me to. Was she pretty?" Daniel paused. The question was innocent, but it reached deeper than Sophie knew. He thought of Isabella. Not the scars, not the whispers, but the strength in her eyes when she lifted her chin against the crowd. "Yes," he said finally. "She was." Sophie grinned, satisfied, and returned to her drawing. Daniel watched her, his heart heavy yet hopeful. He hadn't meant to step into Isabella's world, but something about her lingered in his mind, something he couldn't shake. Days turned into a week, but the memory of the dance refused to fade for either of them. For Isabella, the image of Daniel's steady eyes haunted her. In the quiet halls of the Hartwell mansion, where her father's footsteps echoed like judgments, she replayed the moment again and again, his hand reaching out, her hand trembling as it accepted, the silence breaking as they moved together. It was more than a dance. It was a glimpse of a life not dictated by pride and power. For Daniel, the memory returned each time he looked at Sophie. He thought of what it meant to be seen, truly seen, beyond scars, beyond failures. He had given Isabella a dance, but she had given him something, too. The reminder that even the smallest act of courage could ripple through a life. But their worlds were not designed to meet again. One belonged to marble floors and chandeliers, the other to crowded apartments and double shifts. And yet, fate has a way of unraveling walls built by pride. Because a week later, Isabella left the mansion for the first time since the gala. She found herself standing on a city street, dressed in simple clothes, her face partially hidden beneath a scarf. She didn't know exactly why her steps had carried her there, but when she stopped in front of the cafe on the corner, the one where Daniel worked mornings before his evening shifts, she realized she had been searching for him all along. Through the window, she saw him. Daniel stood behind the counter, pouring coffee with the same quiet strength he had carried on the dance floor. And in that moment, for the first time since the fire, Isabella felt something like hope. She wasn't invisible anymore. The morning cafe was alive with the smell of roasted beans and the clink of porcelain cups. Sunlight spilled across the worn wooden floors, warming the space in a way the Hartwell mansion never could. Isabella lingered just outside the glass door, her reflection staring back at her, scars visible even beneath the edge of her scarf, eyes uncertain, but braver than before. Inside, Daniel moved between tables with the ease of routine. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms dusted with coffee grounds, his focus steady as he balanced mugs and exchanged polite words with customers. There was nothing extraordinary about him here, nothing glamorous. Yet, to Isabella, he carried the same quiet strength as the night of the gala, the same grounding presence that had given her the courage to step onto the floor. Her hand hesitated on the door handle. What was she doing here? She had told herself it was coincidence, that she only wanted coffee, but deep down, she knew the truth. She wanted to see him again. Finally, she pushed the door open. A soft chime rang out, drawing Daniel's eyes instinctively toward the entrance. For a second, he didn't recognize her. Without the gown, the chandeliers, or the stares of 1,000 eyes, She looked almost ordinary. And yet the recognition came swiftly, those green eyes, haunted yet defiant. His heart gave a small, unexpected jolt. "Morning," he said, voice calm but carrying an undertone of surprise. Isabella nodded, stepping toward the counter. She felt the weight of other customers' eyes as they lingered on her scars. But here, in the buzz of the cafe, the whispers were softer, less venomous. Still, she tugged her scarf higher. "One coffee," she said quietly. Daniel met her gaze. "Coming right up." As he turned to the machine, Isabella watched him work. Precise, unhurried, his presence filling the room without effort. He set the cup on the counter, but instead of sliding it forward with the detachment of a server, he held it for a moment, as though weighing whether to speak. "You didn't have to come here," he said finally, his tone gentle. "I know," she replied. Her voice was steady, though her fingers curled against her palm. "But I wanted to." For a moment, the world outside, the clatter of dishes, the chatter of patrons, faded into background noise. They stood across the counter, two lives separated by walls of class and expectation, yet pulled together by something neither fully understood. Daniel broke the silence first. "You were brave that night." Isabella's laugh was soft, almost bitter. "Brave? I was terrified. Terrified and still standing," he said. "That's braver than most." Her eyes flickered, surprised by his sincerity. No one spoke to her like this. Not her father, not the endless stream of polite strangers. They spoke around her scars, or in spite of them, but never to the person she was beneath them. "Why did you do it?" she asked. The question had gnawed at her since the gala. "Why ask me to dance?" Daniel hesitated. He thought of Sophie, of the innocence in her eyes, of the future he wanted her to have. He thought of how it felt to see Isabella standing alone in that glittering room, cast aside by her own blood. "Because no one else would," he said at last, "and because you deserved better." The words struck her like an arrow. She lowered her gaze, the edges of her scarf brushing her cheeks. For years, she had measured herself against the impossible standard of perfection her father demanded. Never enough, never whole. And here was a man with nothing to gain, telling her she was worthy. Before she could reply, the bell above the cafe door chimed again. A small voice rang out. "Daddy!" Sophie burst in, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her hair loose and wild. She ran straight into Daniel's arms, and he lifted her with an ease born of habit, his face softening into a smile Isabella hadn't seen before. Isabella froze, startled by the sudden glimpse of another world, the warmth of family, the tenderness of fatherhood. Sophie leaned against Daniel's shoulder, peering curiously at the woman behind the counter. "Who's she?" Sophie asked, blunt in the way only children could be. Daniel glanced at Isabella, uncertain how to answer. But before he could speak, Isabella smiled, small, tentative, but real. "I'm Isabella," she said gently. Sophie studied her for a long moment, her eyes lingering on the scars. Isabella braced herself for the question, the pity, the cruelty children sometimes carried without knowing. But instead, Sophie simply asked, "Do you like pancakes?" Daniel laughed, relief flooding his face. Isabella blinked, startled by the simplicity, the innocence. She nodded. "Yes, I do." Sophie grinned, satisfied with the answer, and turned back to her father. "She can sit with us, right?" Daniel's chest tightened. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time since the gala, he saw not just strength, but the possibility of connection, of something larger than a single dance. "Only if she wants to," Daniel said softly. And for the first time in years, Isabella found herself saying yes. Richard Hartwell prided himself on control. Control of markets, control of perception, control of the Hartwell name itself. Yet, for the second time in as many weeks, he felt that control slipping through his fingers. The photographs arrived first. A discreet email from one of his associates. Subject line: Hartwell heiress spotted downtown. Richard clicked it open, and there it was. Isabella, sitting at a small cafe table, her scarf loose enough to reveal her scars. Across from her sat Daniel Hayes, the waiter. Between them, laughter lingered in the captured moment, light and unrestrained. And in another frame, a little girl, Sophie, leaned across the table toward Isabella, handing her a crayon with the innocence of unguarded trust. Richard's jaw tightened until the muscle ached. The whispers from the gala had been bad enough, but this was dangerous. This was intimate. This was his daughter breaking from his control. That evening, Isabella returned to the mansion, her cheeks still warm from the laughter she had shared with Sophie. For the first time in years, she had felt normal. Not an heiress, not a scarred recluse, just a woman sipping coffee, smiling at a child's questions, listening to the easy cadence of Daniel's voice. But the warmth faded the moment she stepped through the front doors. Her father was waiting. The study smelled of leather and old wood, the fire in the hearth burning low. Richard sat behind his desk, the photographs laid out in front of him like evidence in a trial. "Sit," he commanded. Isabella hesitated, then crossed the room, her pulse quickening. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her gaze flicking to the images. She knew what they showed. She knew what he would say. "Do you have any idea?" Richard began, his voice calm but edged with steel. "What you are doing to this family?" Isabella swallowed. "I was having coffee, Father. That's all, with a waiter. And his child." He tapped the photographs, each word like a blow. "Do you understand how this looks? The Hartwell name is already fragile after your accident. Now you parade yourself in public with—" "Stop." The word slipped from her lips before she could contain it. Richard's eyes narrowed, startled not by her defiance but by its sharpness. "I'm not a name," Isabella continued, her voice trembling but growing steadier. "I'm not a brand to protect or a stain to hide. I am your daughter, and I will not apologize for being seen." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "You think that man cares about you? You think he sees anything beyond what you represent? He is beneath you, Isabella. He will use you, and when he does, it is our name that will pay the price." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "He's the only one who doesn't see me as a mistake." The silence that followed was colder than fury. Richard's face hardened, his pride wounded deeper than words. He turned away, dismissing her as he had countless times before. "Go to your room," he said finally, his voice low with finality, "and do not see him again." But Isabella didn't move. For the first time in her life, she did not obey. She rose slowly, her hands trembling, her heart hammering, and said words that would shatter the fragile glass of their relationship. "No, Father." Richard turned, his eyes blazing, but she didn't back down. "You've hidden me for years. You've treated me like shame, like something broken. But Daniel saw me. Sophie saw me. And I won't go back to being invisible." The air between them crackled, years of silence and control breaking open. Richard's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. The firelight flickered across his face, carving deep shadows into the lines of his pride. Without waiting for his reply, Isabella turned and walked out. Her footsteps echoed through the mansion's halls, each one a defiance, each one a choice. For the first time, she was leaving on her own terms. That night, Daniel sat in his small apartment, Sophie asleep in her bed, her crayon drawings scattered across the table. He thought of Isabella's laughter, the way her eyes softened when Sophie spoke. He hadn't meant for this to happen, hadn't meant to let her in. But she was already there, woven into the fabric of his life like a thread he hadn't expected but couldn't remove. When the knock came at the door, his heart leapt. He opened it to find Isabella standing there, her scarf pulled tight, her eyes shining with something between fear and determination. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered. And in that fragile moment, Daniel understood. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was looking for a place where she could simply exist, without shame, without whispers, without pride crushing her. "Then you came to the right place," he said softly, stepping aside to let her in. The Hartwell mansion had always been a fortress, but on this night it felt like a battleground. Rumors were already swirling in the media. Photographs of Isabella with Daniel and Sophie had made their way into society columns. Some mocked, some praised, but all of them whispered the same thing. The Hartwell name was no longer untouchable. Richard Hartwell paced his study like a lion denied its kill. Every article, every headline struck at the foundation of the empire he had built. His daughter, the girl he had hidden away, had become the story. And worse, she had chosen her stage without his permission. Down the hill, in Daniel's modest apartment, warmth reigned instead of fire. Isabella sat cross-legged on the floor beside Sophie, who was proudly showing her a picture. A woman with long hair holding hands with a man and a little girl. "That's you," Sophie explained, pointing, "and that's Daddy. And that's me. We're a family." The simplicity of it broke Isabella's heart in the gentlest way. No wealth, no empire, just belonging. She glanced at Daniel, who stood in the doorway, silent but watching her as though she were something sacred. But before peace could root itself, Richard's shadow intruded. A black car pulled up outside, its headlights slicing through the thin curtains. The knock on the door was sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. Daniel answered, his frame tense. Richard Hartwell stood there, flanked by two men in dark suits. He looked at Daniel the way one looks at an insect on fine porcelain. "Where is my daughter?" Richard demanded. Isabella rose to her feet, her scarf slipping loose, her scars catching the dim light. "I'm here, Father." The room seemed too small to contain Richard's fury. "You've humiliated me," he spat. "Our family name is in the gutter. Do you understand what you've done?" "Yes," Isabella said, her voice calm, steady in a way it had never been before. "I've finally lived." Richard's face darkened. With him? With a man who carries trays and scrapes coins to survive? With a child who… "Stop!" Isabella's voice cracked through the room, silencing him. She stepped closer, her chin lifted, her scars revealed. "You've spent years teaching me that appearances matter more than love, more than truth, more than me. But I'm done being your secret." Richard's pride flared. "You would choose him over me? Over everything I've given you?" Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. "She doesn't have to choose. Respect doesn't erase love. Pride doesn't erase pain. But you…" His eyes locked with Richard's. "You've let both destroy her." The words hit harder than Richard expected. For a moment, his mask faltered, a flicker of something human breaking through. But pride rebuilt itself quickly. "You'll regret this," he said coldly. "Both of you. When the world turns on you, don't come crawling back." Isabella stepped forward until she was standing directly before her father. Her hand trembled, but her eyes didn't. "I don't need the world's approval anymore. And I don't need yours." With that, she turned away, walking back toward Daniel and Sophie. Sophie reached out instinctively, her small hand catching Isabella's. That single touch spoke louder than any fortune, any empire. Richard stood in the doorway, his empire intact but his legacy crumbling. For the first time in his life, he was not the one walking away. He was the one being left behind. Weeks later, Isabella sat at the same cafe where it had all begun. The scars on her face had not faded, but the shame tied to them had. Sophie was coloring again, Daniel sipping his coffee beside her. They looked ordinary, beautifully, breathtakingly ordinary. For the first time in years, Isabella didn't feel like a ghost haunting her own life. She felt alive. A soft song played over the cafe speakers, the same melody from the gala, but this time, when Isabella heard it, she didn't hear whispers or pity. She heard freedom. Daniel reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing around hers. Sophie leaned against Isabella's side, smiling up at her with childlike certainty. And in that small corner of the world, love, not pride, not wealth, not fear, became the throne on which Isabella finally stood.